Ladies and gentlemen, we are very honored today with a very special guest, a prolific author and an amazing scientist, Brian J. Ford. Now, in 1971, Brian, he wrote this book here called Nonscience Returns, and 50 years later, Curtis Press is reprinting it. And it basically describes the state of affairs in academia. And it's a pleasure to have you on the show, Brian. You're going to get one of your books here? Oh, you have the original. Excellent.
Well, Nonscience was reprinted with, of course, updates. I was going to do a couple of 1,000 words updates at the end of each chapter. But in the end, there's almost as much new stuff as old stuff in it because so much has happened. But yes, I do have a copy of the original, and there it is. Don't ask me to read the original title. The original title's on the new book anyway. But it did actually debunk the notion of experts, as it were, commercializing science, and where being on the cusp and getting big grants and conning people into believing that what you say is right and the other guy is wrong matters much more than the traditional idea of integrity and authority in science. In other words, traditional scientists were concerned with truth and integrity and the pursuit of knowledge, whereas the modern day expert was concerned with money and fame and power. And the two don't exactly match the way you like to think they should.
I agree with you. Now, you wrote the original book in 1971. Not a lot has changed since then in 50 years. In fact, it has gotten much worse. And a recent paper I saw did an analysis, and they found that 90% of all peer-reviewed papers are written by 1% of scientists. And that's not science. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the original book made the point, and I still have to read the new one. I'm told the reviews have been very pleasant. If I ever get time, if I ever have a holiday, I've never had a holiday yet. One enjoys life too much. But if ever I have a holiday, I'm going to settle down and read that. But the original book made the point that it doesn't matter what you publish. All that matters is how much you publish. And people would say, and they still do. I mean, the main thing that's happened since 71 and 2021, and that's 50 years, is that what the 71 book predicted has all come to pass. And it said then that what you need to do is to publish a large number of papers. And it doesn't really matter what it is you say. So when you're introduced at a meeting, people don't stand up ever and say, this is Professor Scrimshaw, and he's discovered this, that, and the other. They say, this is Professor Scrimshaw, who has published over 126 peer-reviewed papers. The number is all that matters. The quantity is what they want. The quality they couldn't give a stuff about. And I know one eminent person, she'd kill me if she knew I was saying this here. We were in students together. Then she actually published exactly the same publication twice, but with different titles.
Well, that's double dipping. That's double for your money. If it's all about the numbers, I remember that back in the 90s. But there is an effect now. There's a ripple effect. We have, and I don't know if you're on the same side as I am, but let me just throw some of these out to you. In astrophysics, billions upon billions of dollars are spent looking for non-existent dark matter, which can be proven to not exist and simply not be there, and we're just missing some extra dust in the galaxy or something. So we're misappropriating money. And then for the last 30 years, we have this new science called climate science, which is based on a false premise that CO2 warms the atmosphere. And we are wasting billions and now trillions total dollars on non-science. And it can't be that the whole world is just dumb. It's just that you have to be doing what the groupthink is doing. So how do we get around this? Is there any way out? Are we stuck in this horrible paradigm?
Well, I would stand on the opposite side of the fence to you about global warming. In my view, there is not the least doubt that CO2 causes global warming. It's been proved experimentally since the 19th century. I accept that as a given. I don't have any doubt about it. And as for the catastrophic extent of global change, global climate change, well, I mean, I've seen since I was a kid. I remember once taking my now wife, we went to Kew Gardens, the great botanical centre in London, and I showed her tropical plants. We now have them growing in our garden. I have in my garden figs, banana trees, tree ferns, and we live as far north as Newfoundland on the same latitude in Britain. On the other hand, there are many areas where you and I would be nuzzling against each other on the same side of the fence. One of them is this astronomy thing. Astronomy loves to be exaggerated. Astronomers these days, they will take the most trite, for example, meteor showers. Put an example in the book, right? This was a picture of what meteor showers are going to look like, published in a newspaper. What it actually looks like is that, if you're very lucky, you might possibly see the occasional fleeting flash in the sky every, say, 10 minutes or so. And they say that's a meteor shower. The public believe that meteor showers are the sky filled with shards of light all the time. The same with the Northern Lights. Every time you see the Northern Lights on the media, they're always like dazzling curtains of multicolored diaphanous waves flickering and dancing around the sky. When you go there, it's nothing like that. The reason you see them moving so fast is because they're all time-lapse film. The actual aurora moves incredibly slowly. I've seen it many times, and it moves hardly at all. Just the slightest movement. And indeed, you have to stay out there for about 10 minutes or more before your eye gets used to the fact that you're in the dark and you can only just see this very faint light in the sky. Astronomers have been exaggerating like mad. And as a result, we now have this latest craze of exoplanets, where they're telling us, they actually produce pictures of what these bloody planets are supposed to look like, with clouds and continents. All they've got, look, I've got pages of them in the book. All they've got is the slight evidence that because of perturbation in the amount of light we receive from a given star, it could be explained by there being an orbital body. That's possibly so. But open the newspapers and you'd imagine that you've got another Earth and that we'll be there in a fortnight. The notion that it's billions of light years away and has no relationship whatever to the life that we lead on Earth is never mentioned. And the problem you faced, you see, I mean, although you and I stand on opposite sides of the fence about global warming, and I would be delighted to stand and indulge in intellectual fisticuffs with you about it. But the point is that your view could be right. My view could be wrong. The danger is that once you get into a situation where you have an accepted view, I call it fashionism in the original Nonscience. That's how I pronounce it, by the way, not non-science. I would say nonscience because it sounds a bit like nonsense. But the original Nonscience said that once something becomes fashionable, everybody agrees with it. And fashionism overrules everything. And indeed, it's extremely difficult to publish any new theory now without encouraging the loss of all those people who are making money out of the conventional old-fashioned view. And to that extent, I'm with you all the way.
Well, excellent. And I appreciate your approach and your candor. Now let's talk about one of the most fashionable things in the last year, and that is thousands of papers being written about COVID-19. And those then trickle down to the CDC, the World Health Organization, and other groups and governments. And these non-experts, these political people that were elected, then, first of all, they don't read the papers. They listen to the higher-ups who read the papers, who say what the papers say, and so on and so forth. And what I've seen is a lot of bad science, a lot of rush science, a lot of non-peer-reviewed science that's being used to set policy. What are your thoughts on what's going on with the vaccines and this supposed pandemic? And by the way, neither of us have masks on right
now. Just as well viruses don't transmit through the ether. I had a mask on earlier when I went to collect a parcel from a man at the door. Well, firstly, there is some nonsense around. I mean, people have said, and indeed, I remember one quite important politician in the United States said that it's just a hoax. And the implication was that the virus doesn't exist, nor does the pandemic. Well, of course, the virus exists. I've seen it. And of course, the pandemic exists. I'm experiencing it. And yes, vaccines will be the answer. There's not the slightest question about that. The sooner everybody gets vaccinated, the better. But ask yourself the question, why are people not getting vaccinated? It's because the public knows that the health authorities regularly lie through their teeth. In 1950, we had the world's first nuclear problem in Britain at Windscale when a reactor caught fire. In 1946, we started building our first nuclear facility for making warheads for British intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the reactor caught fire at Windscale, and great areas were covered with pollution. You can still go there to this day, and there are warning signs saying to you, if you walk on the beach, clean your shoes afterwards, don't sit down on the sand. It's still radioactive all this time later. And what did the government do? The government commissioned a report, and as soon as Prime Minister Harold Wilson read the report, he ordered it to be destroyed because it was so unsettling. And he kept it all a secret from the United States authorities in case in the US their nuclear people didn't want to cooperate with us in nuclear research anymore. And then you had Chernobyl. When the Chernobyl reactor was opened, the Soviet authorities had articles published saying, this is the safest nuclear facility anywhere in the world. Then you had 3 Mile Island in the States, where the Lord Lieutenant, the governor, was on the media saying, everything is fine, there's no danger or whatever to people, whereas at that same time you had helicopters flying above recording massive doses of radiation in the air. We had thalidomide, the drug developed in Germany in 1957 by ex-Nazi scientists. The drug was released for women to take in pregnancy to prevent morning sickness, and reports began to appear that children were being deformed. And what did the authorities say? No, there's nothing at all wrong with this drug. Hundreds, thousands, I think tens of thousands of babies were born with deformity because of the thalidomide. Look at the Fukushima reactor. Everybody said, no, that's all under control. But the tuna in the Pacific are to this day radioactive. Wherever you look, you find examples. The worst was in Britain in 1986 when bovine spongiform encephalopathy first appeared, mad cow disease. And within a few years, people said that they had evidence to suggest it had been spread to the human population. And yet it wasn't for, I think, 10 years. I remember that one of the government ministers actually had Selwyn Gummer, who was actually out with his daughter at some country fair. And he sort of said to her, here, have this hamburger and show how everybody how safe it is on TV. She was about 7 and she refused to eat it, which is rather good. But the government said, there's no problem with beef. Just keep eating beef. There's nothing wrong with it at all. And hundreds of people died of this new variant CJD. So don't ever ask me, why don't people trust those who are developing vaccines? It's because the authorities lie through their teeth. They always have and they always will. The reason that you should take the vaccine is this. I've read reports saying that so-and-so had the vaccine and then died. Well, okay. The vaccine's been given to tens of millions of people. People die. The chance of dying after you had a vaccine is much the same as dying after you had an ice cream, and you wouldn't ban them. But so far, there is not evidence that a single person has died. And yet you look at the tens of thousands of people who die on the roads. Look at the thousands of people who die from choking. Look at all the people who die from crossing the street, from walking up and downstairs, from eating those hamburgers. We accept enormous risks. Every day of our lives, we submit ourselves to colossal risks. And the risk from the vaccine is the slightest risk anywhere in the universe. For God's sake, get vaccinated. Not only will it stop you from running the big risk of getting ill, but it may save your grandma as well.
Well, we can agree to disagree on that front. Now, I am pro-vaccine for people that maybe are older or have comorbidities, but for the the normal healthy person that's young, I don't think that they should be part of what is right now a global experiment, because there has been very little study on these new vaccines. That's my opinion, and I'm going to stick with that. Now, if we could jump into a different topic, and that is something I'm very interested in, and you came up in 2012 with a new idea about the evolution of man. And what I mean by that, and I've been studying this for decades as well. I even did some field research and found some Clovis points in the East Coast, which I shared with Dennis Stanford. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with him. He's over at the Smithsonian now, I believe. And he is an expert on Solutrean culture. And what I was determining and what we discussed was that there was a very modern race of humans, maybe 20, 30,000 years ago. The Solutreans were the end game of that, to about 16,000. And they had these large bifacial tools that looked like they were butchering animals, but they didn't have really good hunting tools. And then I saw your presentation on how humans were using animals, predators, to get the meat, and then they would scare the predators away. And I thought that was completely fantastic.
Yeah.
Can you expound on that theory and where you are today with it?
Sure. It's a theory I worked on about a decade ago, because I was aware of the obvious evidence for the hunter-gatherer. And I was also aware of the abundant evidence of the pre-humanoid apes, who of course had big muscles and massive teeth and claws and could, run around and catch their prey. But one thing nobody had ever addressed was, how do you get from the one to the other? I mean, the evolutionary progress of mankind has been to become weak and hairless and feeble. And our carnassial teeth, which used to be great big carnivore teeth, have become small. I mean, in every way, we have been evolving away from being something strong enough to catch our prey. And we must eat meat. Now, I'm not saying that vegans or vegetarians are wrong. They're not. But you don't become a vegetarian or a vegan just by giving up meat. You do that by getting your vital things like B vitamins and the other minerals from other sources of food. But humans, not knowing that much about diet millions of years ago, evolved as omnivores. And we can prove that easily. Carnivores have eyes on the front of the head, lions and tigers. Omnivores, herbivores, have eyes on the side of the head, sheep and goats and cows. Carnivores have no appendix. Herbivores have a vast appendix. Humans have a tiny appendix. And wherever you look, you see that we are halfway between herbivores and carnivores. We're meant to be omnivorous. But how are you going to catch meat? Because as your evolution goes on, you're becoming feebler and feebler and feebler. And I thought to myself, I know what happened. Humans would track predatory animals, wolves in this case, I thought. And when the wolves had brought down their prey, the humans would nip in and grab a bit and have whatever was left over. And that also explained our close connection with dogs, because, of course, dogs were developed by man from wolves. And it's most interesting that dogs and humans have been so closely interconnected for so long. I mean, we found burial evidence back 7,000 or 8,000 years of the two locked up together. So my thought was that probably humans began to collect meat by kleptoparasitism, by stealing meat from animals brought down by big, angry, hungry predators like lions and tigers and the wolves. So I published this as a paper, the paper you mentioned in Laboratory News, and it attracted quite a lot of attention. And then I had a phone call, and the chap said, there's a program just been on TV about your theory. I said, oh, really? He said, yes. In Africa, he said, they found some tribe in Kenya that are still hunting in exactly the way that you said pre-Stone Age people would have hunted. And I said, you're kidding. So I saw the program. And there it was. You had these three tribesmen, and they found a place where a pride of lions have brought down wildebeest. And they simply, with their shields, they didn't make a big noise, but very confidently, they walked towards the lions. Scared the shits out of me to watch it. And as they got close, the lions stopped eating and looked at them. And then the lions glanced at each other, and then they ran away. And the men ran in, cut off a haunch and a leg from this wildebeest, and then went back and took it back and cooked it. Then the BBC sent a team out into Siberia where they were looking for ivory from mammoths, and they found a baby mammoth. And the baby mammoth had obviously been killed by some predator or other, but chunks of it had been cut away, presumably by the kleptoparasitic humans. So shortly after I published my theory, two separate strands of evidence came along that suggested that, yes, I was right. And that's why I think we are so close to wolves, our dogs. And it's why I think we were able to become civilized human beings. And when you see people doing things in the modern world, I sometimes think, well, hang on a second. This dates right back to our Stone Age times. I mean, in Britain, we banned fox hunting. But until recently, we had fox hunting and deer hunting, where people would go out with hounds on horseback and they would catch their prey. And I think, this is a modern civilized world's heritage from the time when actually we used to rely on going out and having animals catch the prey for us. So that's why I think the hunter-gatherer human developed from the pre-Stone Age hominid and was able still to get meat whilst evolving to become less able to catch meat. We relied on animals to do it for us. And the fact that in Africa they're still relying on lions to do it rather proves my point, I think.
Yes, excellent, and an excellent point indeed. Now, that's not the only method, because there is evidence to suggest that in the same vein as people scaring predators away from a kill, they were also potentially scaring animals off cliffs in large numbers and harvesting the dead animals below the cliffs. And where I live, there is some of the most amazing mammoth kill sites that are Clovis in age. There are dozens over here in the San Luis Valley in Colorado. And are you familiar with these sites, Dr. Ford?
I'm not familiar with them. I've heard of them when I've been in Colorado, but I've not been to the sites, and it's not an area I've studied. But what you say makes absolute 100% sense to me, yes.
Excellent. And another interesting topic that you're quite famous for is debunking the idea that the Amazon are the lungs of the world. Now, if you could, for our audience, could you please give us a brief synopsis on what happens when you type the lungs of the world into the Googler and the answer you get, and why that is absolute nonsense, as you would say.
I love the way you said that. You've absolutely got it spot on. Yes, let me look up the figure. I mean, everywhere you look, there are so many examples in my book. People talk about the lungs of the earth. Now, if you type lungs of the earth into Amazon, that's to say Amazon, the search engine, as opposed to Amazon, the mighty river, you will find hundreds of millions of sites. Everybody will tell you that the Amazon produces 20% of our oxygen. The whole idea that a rainforest gives us any oxygen at all is, forgive me, viewer and listener, complete, unadulterated crap from top to bottom. And I'll tell you why. When the sun comes out and the tree is standing in the forest, the tree undergoes photosynthesis. It takes in the trace of carbon dioxide from the air, it takes in water from its roots, and it generates carbohydrates. And it makes cellulose and glucose and the other things it wants. And with the trace elements its roots pick up, it creates proteins, and so it grows. It lays down lignin in its tree trunk. It grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And every day when the sun is shining, that's what it does. Every night, when the sun isn't shining, it does exactly what you do. It breathes out carbon dioxide and it consumes oxygen. However, there is a net increase in the amount of carbon that is taken in by the tree. So that your average tree in your average forest all around the world contains about a ton of stored carbon. And there you go. So you think to yourself, well, when those illegal loggers go in and they chop down trees and they're going to sell them for furniture, they're destroying our heritage. No, they're not. By cutting down those trees illegally, I grant you, and selling the wood for furniture or for construction, they're actually locking away the carbon. They are preserving our atmosphere. Nasty little bastards that they may be, but they're not destroying the air. Now, we had in mind a tree growing in the rainforest, and every time it grows taller and taller, it's locking away a little bit of carbon every day. It's liberating a lot every night, but it's locking away more than it liberates. Until, and this is what nobody ever thinks of, until the tree dies. Once the tree has grown to its full height, like every other living thing, it dies. And one day in a hurricane, it blows down, and it lies on the forest floor, and it rots. And if you come back 50 years later, or 5 or 10 years later, if you're in the tropics like the Amazon, the tree is no more. It has been completely decomposed. And what happens during decomposition? It's perfectly simple. Every single atom of carbon that the tree locked away is liberated in the form of carbon dioxide back into the air by the microbes, the fungi, the insects, the bacteria, that come along to degrade the tree. And so from the very first moment the tree germinates, up to its life when it's stored a ton of carbon, to the end of its life when all that carbon has been released back into the air and is decomposed, the tree bequeaths not one atom of oxygen to the air. No, the air we breathe has nothing to do with trees. And if you were to actually try and plant enough trees to absorb the extra carbon dioxide, you'd be planting, I don't know, something on the side of Rhode Island every year for the next 1,000 years. And if you did that, then at the end of 50 years when the trees had grown, you then have to cut the trees down. You mustn't leave the forest or the trees will decompose. You'd have to cut the trees down and store them away for eternity. So no, the Amazon is irrelevant. Now, I am aware that people say, isn't it shocking that the Amazon is being felled? And of course it is. I mean, I've been to the Amazon many times, and I'm horrified at the destruction that I see. I've been to areas where I've seen verdant rainforest, and within a year or two it's been bulldozed, it's been burned out, and it's converted to farmland. Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, what have you done in America? Plowed up billions and billions of acres of verdant area and made it into farmland. I live in the Fens in England, where in the 1600s, the village in which I live, in Cambridgeshire, would have been on an island, surrounded by shallow fens, by swamps and by shallow lakes. It was all drained. That was our rainforest, if you like. And that was all drained by the rich businessmen from London who came up in the 1700s, drove all the people off their land or killed them, drained the fens and created it into farmland. What the authorities are doing in Brazil is exactly the same as what you have done in America and what we have done in Britain. We are bemoaning the fact that they've destroyed their environment, but we've destroyed ours. So yes, let's try and convince them, as I have done, that tourism is probably a better way of making money out of the rainforest than cutting it down and farming it and creating GM soy for beef cattle. It's probably better to keep it in economic terms, but do not be all moral and say to them, how dare they do it? That's how we, as white Westerners, became civilized. That's where we built our wealth. So although we have every right to campaign about the misuse of the forest, we have no right whatever to tell them that they shouldn't do it. That's how we became great and famous. All they're doing is copying our example.
And I love that point, that we're constantly telling people to do stuff that is exactly what we already did. You can't do that. So we clear cut our forests, we pollute the soils, we degrade them, we dump massive amounts of fertilizer, and it runs off into rivers and kills biomes. But you can't do that in third world countries because now we smartened up. But did we? Because the modern society that we're talking about is still polluting the population with its food in the supermarkets, its processed food and chemicals. It's still killing the earth, air, insect biome. We're killing our waterways, our soil, our aquifers, and yet we judge everyone. And that's the state of the modern world, which is a great segue to some closing up questions I have. What are your thoughts on the current state of science, and where do we go from here?
You mentioned the despoliation of the landscape. I have a sneaky feeling that your great Colorado River no longer reaches the sea. Is that right?
It's so dammed up and regulated and irrigated. We are in such drought conditions. The river that we live on here drops as low as 5 cubic feet per second, which is a trickle. So that's the sad state of affairs.
Good luck. You'll have to call it the Colorado Stream in that case.
Yes.
To answer your question, science really needs rethinking from the top. It has become industrialized and commercialized, and everything that matters now is simply getting bigger and better grants. People want massive amounts of apparatus in order to carry out what were simple procedures. I'll give you an example. I'm an authority on microscopes. That's what I work with. And if you bring me a sample, I can put it under my microscope and I can probably tell you what the sample is and where it came from and what it means. But if you were to give that now to some authority, they'd say, we're not interested in what Professor Vaughan says. Where's the printout? What they would want is, let us say, if it's a plant, a DNA profile. And they'd want graphs and sheets, and they want it all printed out nicely, and they want spreadsheets with it all on. They want to see the DNA profile compared with standards, blah, 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 blah. But if you say to me, is that an apple or an orange? I tell you by the simple expedient of looking at it. I don't need to do its DNA profile to tell you. And the problem with science is that the capacity of the brain to actually assimilate data and work out the answer is being subsumed by this ridiculous concept of what we call artificial intelligence. There's no such thing as artificial intelligence. Single cells can show intelligence. What we call artificial intelligence is simply computerized automation. That's all. We've been using machines to automate what humans do ever since Jacquard in France first invented the punched card system for running a loom, which meant that you could press a button on a loom and out would come patterned cloth, instead of people having to painstakingly weave it, thread by thread, weft and warp. It is not new that automation has been taking over jobs. I mean, look at Charlie Chaplin's great films, and you'll see what I mean from 100 years ago. No, artificial intelligence is not artificial intelligence. If it was intelligent, it could mend your marriage, find your car keys, and stop your daughter from sulking. That's intelligence. All artificial intelligence can do is to automate something. People say computers are wonderful because they can do things that no human can do. Big deal. So can a pair of scissors. So can a thumbtack. Humans can't do what they do. There is nothing strange about something humans have invented doing things that humans can't do, because that's why they got invented in the first place. So science firstly needs to re-establish its humanity. It is not a question of having the biggest and flashiest lab filled with all the latest gizmos and flashing lights and blinking LEDs in the darkness of the night. It's up to people to understand that it's intelligence and insight, humanitarianism, thoughtfulness, kindness, modesty, and the ability to be open-minded that is the basis of science. Modern science is to do with massive grants, huge computers, and flashing lights. And science has almost lost its way. One of the reasons I wrote the original book 50 years ago is because I decided not to stay in the University of Cardiff, where I'm still a fellow. But I didn't want to stay in university. What I wanted to do was get out in the world, enjoy myself, and study science as it should be studied. I said to my head of department one day, it seems to me that you study a certain thing, and when you've got your PhD, you then spend your life until you become the world's greatest ever certain thingologist. And he said, that's the system we have. I don't want to do that. I might want to work on a certain thing this week and something totally different next week. I might want to work on three things together. You can't do that, he said. And I said, then I shall leave university and I shall do it in my own way. And that indeed is what I've since done. I enjoy immense freedom as an independent scientist attached to lots of universities, but retaining my independence. Science now has become an industry aimed at fame and getting big grants. And the integrity, the openness, and the sheer intelligence has gone right out of the window.
Well, that was quite refreshing, and you are a pleasure as a guest. I have two quick questions, and then I'll get your final words. The one question is, you've done some of your actual science in the field in Central America. I think you were in maybe Guatemala or Ecuador or somewhere, where you actually were with the indigenous people. Did you have a chance to ask them some simple questions about their heritage, like where did you come from? And what did they tell you if you were able to ask them those questions?
That's a really great question, and I can tell you the answer. Of course, when asked them that. Most of the Brazilian Indians are stateless. They have the same status as wild animals in the jungle. They have the same diplomatic status as an orangutan in Borneo, which I've also been to see. They are just like jungle creatures. They do not have an official ID number. They don't belong to the state. The Brazilians, so-called, are in fact white people from Portugal who came out and colonized the area and bequeathed to it a European culture. It runs like Europe. And the people, who of course are mixed race between Europeans and indigenous tribes, the people now, they have their passports and so forth, but an Indian could not apply for a passport because he doesn't officially exist. It's extraordinary, but their heritage is vast. I have walked through the Amazon rainforest with them, and they have shown me plants and animals. They've shown me curare. And I mean, we now use curare in our operating.
Oh dear. Oh dear. Dr. Ford, are you there? You seem to have frozen up, and we're just going to pause. Okay, you're back. You froze up when you began explaining where they came from.
All right. The modern Brazilians are Europeans, and their culture is European. They have the gorgeous kind of honey, slight light tanned skin that we white Europeans spend hours every year lying in the sun to try and acquire, because the Europeans interbred with the local population. But the local people, they don't have passports. They can't have passports because they don't legally exist. And yet it is their country. We just went out in the same way that we went from Europe to North America and pretty well exterminated the culture there. We just took over Brazil. And most of the people you meet in Brazil who tell you they're Brazilians are, of course, of European descent. So I have enormous sympathy. There are still half a dozen tribes in the jungles of Brasilia, where there are still half a dozen tribes in the jungles out in Brazil who've had no human contact. And whenever people try and make contact, they treat them aggressively. They've obviously heard from other people what civilization means. That's not to say they don't want civilization. The first time I went up the Amazon, which must be, I don't know, nearly 20 years ago, they were running about in dugout canoes. When I was in school, you too, I expect, we were told that dugout canoes were what they had in the Stone Age. No. Dugout canoes are still the mainstay of life for thousands, millions of people all around the tropics to this day. The last time I went out there, the women no longer had naked breasts, which until then they had borne with complete lack of shame. It's what they'd always done. Now they cover themselves. They're wearing Western T-shirts, and they go about in little skiffs with outboard motors. And the dugout canoes are lying in creeks full of water and slowly rotting away because they're acquiring Western values. And that's the great thing to stop and think about. We want them to stay the way they are, the traditional notion of the noble savage. We want to go visit these people on holiday. We want to take vacations in the Amazon and see these people and look at their wonderful old-fashioned way of living. But they want a nice condo. They'd like a house and a car. That they'd like to be able to go to school and wear a nice suit and go to a mall. So what right have we got to deny them the benefits that they see all the time on their satellite TVs? So within 20 years, I've seen them going from basically speaking being an almost Stone Age existence to being a sort of run-down version of Mexico. And it's not a pretty sight.
There we go, screwing up everything again, which is what we've been pretty good at doing for hundreds of years, destroying our planet, and now we're destroying other cultures. Is there any thing you've been working on recently that you would like to share with us? Any new research, any new hobbies or trips you're planning?
Rate of my overseas. Now, of course, all my lectures are online. It's extraordinary how it's all changed. So I'm afraid no, trips are right out of the window. They may come back. I'd rather hope they do. I've been working on the intelligence of the living cell and showing how living cells make decisions. We love to think that the human brain works by generating intelligence at the synapses where the neurons of the brain meet but don't quite touch. No, they don't. The thought goes on inside each neuron. This in here is not a supercomputer. Each neuron is a supercomputer, which means that the brain is probably 1 billion times more complicated than we ever thought it was. And that doesn't surprise me in the least. We use only a small amount of our brain. And whereas people in the Amazon rainforest know every plant and every animal and every sign of the weather and all the things they should know, modern kids know absolutely next to nothing. Modern kids are cannon fodder. They know enough to grow up, to create wealth for their bosses, and then to die peacefully and go away and be forgotten about. That's all we train them for. When was any child in school taught how to hang a shelf or how to make love or how to raise children or how to cook or how to travel or the importance of insurance, how to run a home? I mean, how often are kids taught any of the things they need to know in school? I was quite good at algebra. And although I worked in science for 60 years, I don't think I've ever used algebra once.
I can agree with you. It's the dumbing down of society, and we are the slaves for the masters. I can remember back, I was the last generation, I'm going to turn 50 in August, where we actually had something called tech school in the high school where you could learn how to do wood shop, metal shop. And then right after I graduated, that all is gone. You don't get to learn anything. You don't even get to figure out how to balance your checkbook. But you will do Algebra 3, and I mean, that's really come in handy. Even when I was in graduate school, I didn't need Algebra 1, 2, or 3. And I took hydrology, fluid dynamics. I mean, this is crazy. What are your final words? And once again, it's a pleasure having you on the show. Check out the book, the reprint, the 50-year reprint, Nonscience returns. And I love that pronunciation. You can get it at Curtis Press. We'll have links below. One other thing I wanted to shout out is Brian has a website. I'm going to show it to you right here. It's at brianjford.com. And Curtis Press has the book for sale, Nonscience Returns by Brian J. Ford. Absolutely a pleasure to have you on the show. Do you have some final words for our people?
Yes, of course. Buy it at a discount from Amazon. The other thing I was going to say, you're 50. Listen, matey, I'm over 80. When I was in junior school.
Oh, dear.
Pastry. I could even make, now I could go and make eclairs for you if you wanted, from what I learned in school. I learned how to identify jet planes. I mean, all sorts of things that they taught us in school, which they don't know. My grandson, some years ago, he said, I must get some stuff. We're doing cookery in school. I said, really? He said, yes, they haven't done cookery in school. Can you imagine this? They haven't taught cookery in school. For Christ's sake, how can you wonder about why people aren't eating properly? They haven't done it for 20 years. They're reintroducing it. So I said, what do you want? He said, I want a pizza base, some sliced pepperoni, and a bag of mozzarella. I said, That's not cooking, that's assemblage. Needless to say, as with all my kids, I taught him to cook at home.
Yeah, that's one of the most important skills anyone can have. And our channel, our motto is proper prior preparation prevents piss poor performance, which is an old English war adage, I believe, or a military adage. And there's,
Probably.
it's always good to be prepared for all eventualities, and cooking is probably the most important one. I recently had a friend who's in his 20s tell me he just learned how to cook, and I was like, wow, excellent.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. All power to your elbow. Even if you're barking up the wrong tree, you have every right to bark.
Yes, and I believe that we showed quite well that scientists that are on completely different sides of the fence can have an intelligent conversation about multivariate topics, and we don't have to sling, let's say, anything unnecessary at each other, because we can always agree to disagree. Pleasure having you on the show. Hope we can have you back again soon, Brian, and go check out his book. Have a wonderful day.
I really enjoyed myself. You take care.